Security vulnerabilities are everywhere in OT or ICS environments. And one area that a lot of people aren't looking to, believe it or not, is PLCs or Programmable Logic Controllers. PLCs are the most common type of control system that we have in OT environments today. And we need to be looking a lot more closely at these systems that we have in our OT environments. And real quick, I wanted to thank our friends over at RunSafe Security, who are leaders not only in memory safety, but SBOM driven protection that we're going to talk about in this video that affects those types of systems that we find in OT or ICS environments. So special thanks again to RunSafe Security. Now, when we talk about or ask, what is a PLC? This is what we're talking about. And maybe you've seen one, maybe you haven't, but this is the main type of, I say, computer that we use to control equipment out in the real world. Sometimes engineers don't like it when I call it a computer, but at the same time, it has a CPU, it has memory, it has some drive space, not a lot because we're not processing gigabyte spreadsheets. We're just storing a little firmware and storing a little programming, right? The logic on how the PLC operates and what it's monitoring and controlling out in the real world. But this is the most commonly type of asset or system that we have out in OT environments, monitoring and controlling what's going on. But people don't look as closely to these from a cybersecurity perspective as they should, believe it or not. When I first started getting into OT or ICS cybersecurity, I was really fascinated with the idea of PLCs or just controllers in general. And that's what we saw in the Stuxnet attack back in 2010, which is where I started getting interested in OT. And then fast forward 4 or 5 years ago, and then fast forward a few years when I started actually working in OT or ICS environments. I actually met one of the gentlemen that runs literally one of the largest cybersecurity programs for control systems. And we were having a conversation, and he made a comment about, oh, that's a PLC. It doesn't have vulnerabilities. And I was really stunned. I was like, what? And then I really started to doubt myself because I'm still very very new to the field and didn't have a ton of experience, especially out in the field and sitting in this large environment having this conversation with this gentleman that again runs one of the largest programs in the world for OT or ICS cybersecurity. I'm like, well, surely he must know what he's talking about, and I don't. And then I started thinking, I mean, it's hardware, it's software, it's a processor, it's memory, right? We worry about common memory issues like buffer overflows in OT systems, just like we do in IT systems. And so I pulled up a web page and looked up the a buffer overflow vulnerability that was associated with one of the types of PLCs that they actually used on that project. So my sanity was restored, and and actually didn't point that out to the gentleman, but did have a conversation on the side with the engineers that worked for him on the project, and made sure everybody was clear that yes, these systems do have vulnerabilities, but unfortunately, it's still one of those areas that in a lot of environments, especially as those environments are maturing their OT cybersecurity programs, they're still not looking at PLCs in as much detail as they should. Now, at the very beginning of 2024, the Russians had gone in over the network and impacted a PLC or controller that was used to monitor and control heating throughout 600 apartment buildings in the Ukraine. And the Russians had used a very simple tool that Dragos calls FrostyGoop. I know, not the greatest name. They get a lot of flack for that, right? But the Russians use this very simple tool that you can create in a few minutes with ChatGPT. And they use that tool to make changes to that controller to shut down or turn off heating for 2 days in 600 apartment buildings, right? Not apartments, apartment buildings in Ukraine in the middle of winter, sub-zero temperatures outside. At least those buildings had power, but they didn't have any heating. And again, that's one of those areas where environments aren't looking at all the different types of vulnerabilities associated with PLCs. We're not even going to be able to have the time to cover all of them in this video, but I do want to highlight some of the more important ones. And before we move on, I just want to again, kind of reiterate, right? We have these controllers everywhere in OT environments. They're responsible for watching what's going on in the world, right? They're collecting data from sensors that allow us to see, okay, what's going on in the environment at any time. And then we also use those systems to make changes out in the real world, changes to equipment, right? Turning things on or off, or making them move. And what people forget, because a number of reasons, that these PLCs are very easy to exploit, a lot easier than you would think. So how do attackers impact PLCs, which in turn, impact the environment? Because those PLCs are monitoring what's going on. They're controlling what's going on in the environment. If I can control one of those PLCs, I can control what's going on out in the real world. Because these PLCs use unauthenticated protocols most of the time, the vast majority of the time, which means you can connect to them with no username, no password. You can read information from memory. Right? What is it seeing in the environment? I can read that out of memory. And if I want, I can make changes to those data points or those values that then are reflected in the real world where the controller makes those changes. Where I can, again, do things like turn things on and off. We can also look at manipulating what we call the operating mode of the PLC. Because normally a PLC should be up and running and doing its job. But what if I suddenly stop the PLC from doing its job? How would that impact the environment where you almost basically have this runaway process where it's no longer being monitored or controlled? It's just going to do what it's going to do. And in a lot of OT environments, that can be very unsafe. It can be actually deadly. We also talk about PLC coding issues. What if someone is able to make changes to the code running on the PLC, which is what the PLC uses to determine how to make changes out in the real world based off of the values, that it's getting when it's monitoring. Hey, what's going on in the environment? Is everything working appropriately? If not, let me make these adjustments. Well, what if I, as an attacker, go and put malicious changes into that code and then have changes happen in the environment that weren't supposed to? Okay, maybe it's something that impacts safety, or it brings down maybe a production line in a manufacturing facility. So now we're no longer producing that specific product. And we can also have firmware issues. There have been known issues like Trisis or Trident, and where we've had attackers get into the environment and be able to put malicious firmware on those controllers. So essentially then the attackers have full control over the system to do whatever they want in that environment. So hopefully you start to get an idea of some of the risk associated with the programmable logic controllers or the PLCs that we have in our OT environments. And again, in some ways, we're just scratching the surface. But again, I did want to highlight some of the more common risks that we see. Now, a few years ago, some folks out of the S4 Cybersecurity Conference actually started the top 20 secure PLC coding practices project to help us understand some of these top risks and not only what those risks are, but how to protect against them. So if you want to check out the top 20 secure PLC coding practices, you can go to plc-security.com and you can see the project. And if you want, if you click on PLC Top 20, it's essentially just the homepage. You can go to download, and typically where I'll go, you can download them in a PDF, or you can just click preview, which will actually pull up the PDF for you. So let me go ahead and I'm going to scroll to the top, and I'm going to maximize this at least a little bit, make it a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on better. And so you can see, can they start breaking down these different risks associated with PLCs and then how we can defend against them and some of these issues that, again, we're going to talk about. Because PLC codes, just like systems we have in IT, right? Again, they're pieces of hardware. They're computers that have hardware and software and an operating system, or really firmware in this case, and they run code. And so there's issues, right? There's vulnerabilities with not only potentially that code that's running on top of the operating system, again, the firmware in this case, because these are embedded systems. But what about the firmware itself? That can actually have vulnerabilities in it, especially when the authors of those firmware borrow components from others that they might not be aware of vulnerabilities already being in that code that they're borrowing to put into their own firmware and many others. But you can start to, again, you can go through this list. And some we're starting to touch already on in this video, and we'll come back and talk about a few more. Again, not only just the vulnerabilities and the risks, but how we start to also look at addressing those vulnerabilities, especially when we look at how we do vulnerability management in OT versus IT, because it's very different. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. Again, it's always about understanding these different vulnerabilities, not just with like accessing the PLC remotely over the network using an unauthenticated protocol like Modbus, where we can make changes to what's going on in memory, even though, yeah, that's definitely a significant vulnerability. But what about vulnerabilities that exist in the firmware? Remember, the operating system of that PLC, or in the code, the logic running on the PLC itself. But that's the top 20 secure PLC coding practices. So definitely take some time, look at that. If you see terms or concepts that you're not familiar with, spend some time with Google or ChatGPT or Gemini these days, right? Going through and understanding not only what a PLC is, but some of the vulnerabilities that are associated with having these different systems in our OT environments. So at this point, we started to look at not only, okay, we have these PLCs that are everywhere in OT, but these PLCs also have a large number of vulnerabilities. So I always do like to start looking at not just the unauthenticated protocol use like Modbus and being able to interact remotely with that PLC to make changes to what's going on in the environment, but also think of, the firmware that's rolling on these controllers. So we have controllers themselves. You can think of them just like a PLC in or I should say a PC in IT, right? Where it's sitting there and it has an operating system like Windows or Linux, and it's controlling what's going on with the system itself. It's managing the processor and the storage space and what's going on in memory. And we have the same thing happening with firmware on PLCs. And we have to also start to think of like those operating systems running on PCs in IT, that those PLCs are exploitable and that they can have vulnerabilities in things like memory, right? Where we talk about buffer overflows that could be used to take control over the system itself. So then we can start looking at, well, how do we harden the PLC? How do we harden the runtime of what's going on with the firmware and how it's actually loading or using and putting data into memory to be able to allow the PLC to run. That's a big part of, just like in the IT world on PCs, right? How do we secure those, right? From exploitation, right? How do we mitigate the risk? In this case, so in the OT world, we're talking about how do we do this on controllers like PLCs and RTUs, or remote terminal units, which are just essentially another type of controller. And we have to do this all at the same time, making sure we're not interfering with the process and the environment itself. A lot of these OT assets are very deterministic. We have to be able to communicate. We have to send information from point to point in a very small amount of time, sometimes under milliseconds, from point to point. And if we don't get that data, that information from point to point within the allocated time, right, the entire process could fail. And sometimes those failures could lead to safety issues, let alone having the plant crash down and all of a sudden you're no longer producing what you're producing. Like, if it's a power plant, you now have a blackout on your hands. Or if you have a manufacturing facility making golf balls, right? At that point, you're no longer making golf balls. You're losing money. So how do we protect these systems from these different types of exploits? Very, again, similar to what we see in the IT world. Now, one thing we hadn't started to talk about, but we have to keep in mind when we're talking about OT assets, is that OT assets, like PLCs that live in, say, manufacturing environments, right? These were designed to last years and years, if not decades. Whereas in IT, a lot of our assets, right, we turn them over every 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years or so. Where OT assets are designed and meant to live a lot longer into the future. And we have a lot of other special considerations around, well, how do we manage vulnerabilities with these systems? Can we patch them, right? When are we even allowed to patch them? In OT, vulnerability management and patching is very different than in IT. In IT, right, a new patch comes out, you're pretty much usually deploying the patch maybe with a little testing, but you're pretty much rolling out those patches pretty quick within a couple days, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month or so, but usually it's pretty quick. In OT, it's quite the opposite, right? We're say, hold on, let's look at this vulnerability. Let's get the right people in the room, like engineers and the folks that are responsible for operations and maintenance of the plant, and have a conversation on, does this vulnerability even mean anything in our environment? Is there any risk to us in our particular environment? And if there's no risk to safety and there's no risk to operations or availability of the plant, then why do we actually need to do anything about it? So in OT, when we talk about vulnerability management, we typically will talk in terms of now, next, or never, right? This is something that would impact safety. So, hey, we need to address this now versus this could impact operations under specific conditions, and the probability of it happening is probably medium to high. So we'll say, okay, well, let's take care of this in the next change window, right? The next maintenance window, even though that could be in 6 months or a year or two, but it's at least on the schedule. Or then we might just come back and say, if it's never going to impact safety, if it's never going to impact the operations of the plant, then yeah, probably never do anything with it. So that's this idea of now, next, and never. So we have to look at, again, are we going to patch it or not? And if so, when? Of course, when we do patch, then we have to have a backup plan in case, well, what if the patch does crash the controller? Not that that would ever happen, right? Right, but we have to make sure we have a fail-safe plan. And then we also start to look at not only patching or any other solutions like we were to bring into the environment, but we have to make sure that they integrate appropriately with OT. So when you look at a system like RunSafe security, right, making sure that it allows for no disruptions of service, and that allows us to maintain that real time, not only communication, but ultimately the performance of and availability of the plant. Because remember, when we have data moving in OT from point to point, it's very deterministic. It has to get from point A to point B in a very specific and very short amount of time. And we can't have anything interfere with that. Otherwise, we're at risk of the plant coming down or having some type of safety issue. So another area of OT cybersecurity that is vastly overlooked is the idea of SBOMs, or software bill of materials, right? This idea is allowing us to have a list of the different software components that are used to make up overall larger packages of software, like when we look at firmware. So when you think of the firmware running on a PLC, we've bought that, we've purchased that from a vendor, and we just assume that it's safe and it doesn't have any vulnerabilities, or at least that's what most people do. Right? I assume there are vulnerabilities, but I would say most people assume, oh, we bought it from a manufacturer, we bought it from the vendor, so we're going to assume they know what they're doing, right? And it's perfectly safe. There's no vulnerabilities in it, right? When you start looking at Firmware, like any other piece of software, it's going to have vulnerabilities. It's made by humans, or maybe now it's written by AI. But right now, I know AI and humans, we make a lot of mistakes. And so there's vulnerabilities in these pieces of software. So that's where when we talk about controllers and worrying about safety or security around firmware, we can use platforms like RunSafe Security to take that firmware, upload it, and then you get a report, right? Where the tool actually generates one of those SBOMs. It gives you a list of, okay, here's all the different software components that are running or that are used to build this firmware that you have running in your environment. And not only here's a list of the components, but you can look at, are there any vulnerabilities in each of those components? And if you have vulnerabilities, well, how bad are those vulnerabilities, right? What's the level of associated risk? Low, medium, high, critical? Again, we can take that information from that one SBOM, or what about making sure we have SBOMs for all of our systems in the environment? So we're having a platform that allows us to have all of these SBOMs and allowing us to see all of our vulnerabilities. And again, not just the vulnerabilities, but the associated risk. So we can determine what do we do over time. It helps us prioritize our workload. If you have a list of 100 vulnerabilities, it's like, where do you start? Are these low risk vulnerabilities, the critical risk vulnerabilities, or somewhere in between? More than likely, yeah, we're going to use that prioritized list to start with those criticals. But again, in OT, it's all about, do these vulnerabilities even apply? So you can use the platform to also help us understand and work with the appropriate team members to understand, do these vulnerabilities even apply in our environment? So that's why we love to have different tools, different platforms like RunSafe Security in the environment that allow us to, again, upload the firmware, tell us what vulnerabilities are in it, tell us the associated risk, and then we can use that information with the appropriate team members from engineering and operations and maintenance to determine, do we need to patch these? Do we need to address these? Or maybe not, because it's not going to impact safety or vulnerability. But at the end of the day, it's all about understanding what's in the environment, right? Knowing that we buy hardware and software, we firmware, and we're bringing it into the environment, it's going to be vulnerable, and that we need to watch for vulnerabilities over time and then determine again whether we need to take action or not to make sure that we keep everybody at the plant safe, right? The general public living in the vicinity of that plant safe, and make sure the plant itself stays up and running and producing what it produces. And the other great thing about when we look at tools like RunSafe Security, that you have a platform not to create just to create SBOMs, right? But when we look at the vulnerability protection, when it actually can go in and add memory safety protection into the PLC. So when we start looking at, remember going back to the top 20 PLC controls, and this idea that the PLC is, it's just like that PC in IT. It has vulnerabilities. It has vulnerabilities associated with how it puts information into memory and how an attacker could actually manipulate that into an exploit that could give them access or some level of control over that system. So we look to platforms like RunSafe Security to be able to also add that memory safety vulnerability reduction to where you can, and in the platform, you'll actually see where you can bring that level of risk down, and sometimes as low as 0.1%, which doesn't get really much better than that realistically, because I don't think we'll ever say anything can be 100% secure, right? It's never going to bring the risk down to 0%, but that's about as close as you can get. But thank you for watching. And again, a special thanks to our friends over at RunSafe Security for sponsoring the video. If you want to learn more about the platform and how it can help address issues that we have in OT, like vulnerabilities with PLCs, check out the link in the description below. But you have to remember that PLCs and other controllers that we see in OT environments, right? I know a lot of people hate to hear me say this, but they're just like those computers that we have in IT. They're written by humans and AI these days, right? But none of us are perfect, right? They have vulnerabilities. They're more unsecure, right? In a lot of different ways. And so we have to make sure that we're looking at all these different types of vulnerabilities associated with using these controllers, with these PLCs that we have in the environment to be able to understand, again, not only where those vulnerabilities are, but the associated risk. And again, do we need to address these vulnerabilities in our environment or not? If we do, want to make sure we address those vulnerabilities before an attacker finds them and uses them against us.